Hey, we're in the process of tying things off on Matthew chapter 25 and the parable of the talents. We've been working on this for a couple of weeks now, but these last few days, what you're getting is just super honest, unscripted processing of the whole thing for myself because it raised a lot of questions for me. I think it raised a lot of questions for you. This is a very challenging parable when you take it out beyond the context and think about what it means for like you or me if we want to do the kingdom citizen thing and where we fit and what does it mean if we screw something up. And so we're gaming that out, and hopefully you listen to the last couple because this is just one more installment of the same ongoing conversation we're having. I'm going to have Jeff play a song and then we'll get after it. So the question is, what about the forgiveness of Luke 15? Could that apply to the situation of the person who got it wrong as we read the parable in Matthew 25? And I think the resounding answer has to be yes. There's a super famous passage about grace that if you haven't been around Christianity much or you're still sizing this thing up, you might not know this one. But if you have been around it, you probably memorized this in Sunday school. You probably heard it a gajillion times. But there's this one little passage in Ephesians 2. Ephesians is a letter that the later Christian Paul wrote to some of the different groups of Christians in the very beginnings of the church as it was popping up around the Mediterranean world. And he in these letters, he explains a lot of Christian theology, and he's answering a lot of the questions that people would have after reading the parables of Jesus and hearing about this stuff. And I think in this super famous passage in Ephesians chapter 2, both the expectations of God for his attentive servants, I think both that is made evident, but also like the grace, the safety net, you're probably not going to get this all right. Like only God gets this all right. There's only one who's good. It's God. That grace thing is right here as well. And it happens in like 3 verses. Listen to this. And as you do, obviously, keep in mind the hypothetical stuff we're throwing out about Matthew 25 and the people who tried real hard, but it didn't work out. Or heck, even the person who didn't try at all when was an idiot, but then realized they were an idiot. Paul writes, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourself. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." Okay, we're putting a pin in that. That's Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. Nobody, just like Jesus indicated all the way back in chapter 5, the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, there isn't a righteousness that you have access to here. If there is a righteousness that can make you right before the law, it's only the righteousness of God handed off to you. And we still haven't got to the punchline of Matthew, but that's kind of how things work out with the whole cross and resurrection and all of that business. It's a reconciling act on the part of God to resolve the crisis of sin and death at the expense of the master we've been learning about, at the expense of the king who we've been learning about throughout the whole book of Matthew. So the whole idea then is, if anybody's going to be right with God, based on everything Jesus has said, everything we've read in Matthew, everything we read in the rest of the whole Bible, if anybody's going to be right with God, it's going to be because of God. It's not going to be because you were righteous like the Pharisees. No, your righteousness would have to exceed even that of the Pharisees who were righteous. They didn't make technical mistakes on a law that they could even gerrymander to suit their own behavior. Like they aren't going to screw it up if they get to make and change the rules as they see fit. So this is hyperbole that Jesus is using to say there's an actual perfection that is unobtainable by people. Jesus is pointing out, even if you could control all of your actions at the level of the heart, humanity is broken because humanity is not God. Humanity is flawed and finite by nature. God is flawless, unchanging, and infinite by nature. And if there is to be a salvation or a deliverance for the finite, it has to come from the infinite, not the other way around. The finite cannot will itself into being the infinite. The tainted cannot will itself into being pure. Once again, it's by the grace of God that all of this stuff, that everything we're talking about, the whole kingdom business, that all of it works out because of the character and work of God. But if we just read Matthew 25, we might look at that and be like, I don't know. It looks like right there at the parable of the talents, it's about the hard work of the people. And these 3 servants, they got gifted something and then they got a good return, and that's why they were welcomed in. Well, that isn't really the full picture. Again, think about how much we've talked about the specific context that we're looking at here in Matthew 24 and 25. That the larger context would indicate that the reason that kingdom citizens do good works and participate in kingdom stuff and get a return on that investment is because Back over to Ephesians. We read Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. Now here's the sometimes forgotten following verse, Ephesians 2:10. So it's by grace you've been saved through faith. This isn't from yourselves. It's a gift of God. It's not by works, so that no one can boast. Now here's verse 10. For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. And wow, there is so much going on there. So if you'll allow me to stretch the imagery of the parable of the talents in Matthew 25 that we've been looking at just a little bit here, we are God's workmanship, which means that in this analogy, the master made the servants. The master raised up the servants. The master equipped the servants. Everything about their status, their position, their opportunity, even their existence, if we want to stretch it all the way up to the ends of what's actually being taught here, all of that is the work of God. They were not alive, now they are alive. They were not heirs, now they are heirs. They were not vested, now they are vested. They were not called son and daughter, now they are called son and daughter. So we're God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works. But get this, even like if at that point people were like, oh, okay, so that's the part that you can boast about. Like you can't boast about God raising you up as a servant or son or daughter and heir, a kingdom citizen. You can't boast about God making you vested, but like you could boast about your good works because that's your thing. But then the final sentence is, or final clause is, which God prepared in advance for us to do. How does that all work? God is infinite. And the idea here is that anything that happens that is glorifying to God, that is building of his household, that is in keeping with his values, that is a return on the investment, to use the Matthew 25 language again. Anything that happens like that, God prepared in advance, and he gets credit even for that stuff. Now you might listen to all of that and be like, what a stupid religion. Like, this is so dumb. Like, you bust your butt and you do all this stuff, and in the end, you don't get credit for any of it. God takes credit for all of it. Like, even if you worked super, super, super hard. It kind of sounds like the old Obama, you didn't build that remark that he made off the cuff one time in a speech that upset a lot of people. Like, what the heck? But I think as we've seen together in working through the book of Matthew, if we peel back the layers just a little bit and think about the state of humanity and the state of this absolute undying king and this absolute kingdom with absolutely right and good and virtuous values, we see that there's really no other way it could be. Either God is unlimited and has everything he needs in and of himself and doesn't need to change, and there's nothing we could offer him that he couldn't just make for himself in some other way, or God is just a slightly exaggerated version of us who is susceptible to all the same weaknesses, foibles, and limitations, and therefore is unqualified to deliver on the promises that go along with this kingdom, the promises that have been held out since the beginning of time, and that Matthew presents Jesus as being the fulfillment of. I know that was a lot. So again, what I'm saying is this. If we throw out a hypothetical wherein somebody comes back to the master in the parable of the talents and is like, I tried real hard. I'm totally on board. I'm crazy about you. I want your thing to win. And it came back even. I didn't make any return on it. I'm sorry. Or if somebody came back and was like, all of those same things, but I lost it all. If that is indeed possible, and some might argue that it's not, but if that is indeed possible, it raises the question, how would the master hypothetically respond? And I think what we see by looking at Luke 15 and the parable of the lost son who came back and was received with grace, forgiveness, and restoration, and what we see when we look at Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, for it's by grace you've been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, but it's the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. For we're God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. If we add up all of those things, what we see is a picture of the parable of the talents describing a right orientation. The kingdom citizen has been restored from something, built out of nothing. The kingdom citizen has been vested with riches that are not their own. And the only thing that is right or noble or good or grateful or virtuous to do is to reinvest those things that you can't keep anyway and that you don't own anyway in the service of this great kingdom. If you don't, it means that maybe you don't really understand the master and maybe you're not really actually in on this whole kingdom thing. Like, how could you not want to? Common sense tells us that there's going to be varying degrees of quality in the return. Jesus himself acknowledges this in the parable of the sower in Matthew 13. Some of it produces a return of 30 times, 60 times, 100 times. It's not the same deal everywhere. There are different circumstances. There are different factors involved. And so the idea here is that there is this safety net of grace within kingdom values, the character of the king is such that his benevolence makes it so people can take big swings, so people can take a shot at this stuff. And it might not always go perfectly, and your own character might get in the way, or even if your own character was just perfect, circumstances beyond your control might get in the way. I don't know. The return won't always be as neat and tidy and perfect as in this hypothetical example in Matthew chapter 25, but it's okay because the safety net of the character of God exists. I know this is a parable that has given all of us a lot to think about, and so I'm just not done yet. So we're going to talk about it a little bit more tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.